Hi everybody, welcome to today's Cogito webinar. My name's Emma Nauman, for those of you who haven't met me before. I'm the Sales and Membership Manager at Cogito. I can recognise a few people who are attending today, but also quite a few names that I haven't spoken to, so welcome. Just to give you some background about Cogito, we're a people insights business combining data, analytics and research to help make informed people decisions, whether it be hiring, organisational strategy, reward, competitor intel or employer brand. Recently, a lot of my conversations have been focused on how businesses can fix the skills gap and fill vacancies they have currently. So we've been looking a lot at recruitment outsourcing to support businesses, and also look at their longer term recruitment model, as obviously the ways of the world have changed, and what candidates also expect and are experiencing is also new. So I will hand over to Ruari shortly, who has put together lots of research for some of our clients, but also has really studied and spoken to and collated information from candidates to understand what they're experiencing in the moment, to help hopefully give you a bit more insight into what might be happening and a few soft predictions for the future as well. So I will hand over to Ruari to begin. Enjoy.
Perfect, thank you, Emma. So my name is Ruari Fangman. I'm the Solutions Lead for Data and Insight Services at Cogito. So my team conducts research for businesses into all kinds of employment-related topics. So things like organisational design, international expansion, pay and benefits benchmarking, employer brand research, basically anything that can be done around businesses. And today we've got a whole load of data to share with you about the labour market, how it's changed over the last couple of years, kind of impact of COVID and Brexit and those pieces, and then also candidates' experiences of looking for work during this time. As we go through, please do put any questions that come up in the question box, and we will go over them at the end. Equally, if you have any questions that come up after the session, please do feel free to pop myself or Emma a message, and we'd be more than happy to get back to you. So without further ado, let's begin. So in this webinar, we're going to cover a few different bits. So starting at a top level, we're going to look at the general state of the labour market. How has the employment market recovered from COVID? The number of job vacancies and how wages have changed, and then also a little bit on the impact of Brexit. As we're now in the run up to Christmas, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on retail and seasonal workers, and I'll also potentially be sticking my neck out and making some predictions there. And then we're also going to run through some of the data we've been collecting from our research projects to understand a bit more about the labour market from a candidate's perspective. So the amount of approaches they're getting, who those approaches are from, and what they're most likely to respond to. We're also then going to look at some of the data about motivators that we've been collecting. And finally, we're going to bring this all together to try to understand what everything we've looked at means, essentially. What's likely to happen in that kind of short to medium term future, and then what we can do about it as well. So first of all, I just wanted to talk a little bit about where we've got the data from that I'm going to use in this session. So there's two primary sources. Firstly, data that we've been collecting from research projects over the last couple of years, and then data we've collected in our September 2021 candidate pulse survey of, I think it's about 100 candidates. And then secondly, there's a whole load of data from the Office of National Statistics, and that's predominantly from the monthly labour market overview that they publish. But we've also got some data in here about the economy and data from Adzuna and Indeed about the number of job postings. So the state of the labour market. Over the last couple of years, we've had two potentially seismic events that have impacted the whole economy and labour markets in general. So that's Brexit and obviously the COVID pandemic. Now, both of these have made it a little harder to understand and perhaps predict what's happened and will happen to the labour market in general. And I think we're just starting to get to the point we can really understand the impact that both of these events have had. On top of that, the current government is borrowing at rates that are the highest since the Second World War, and that's obviously fairly unprecedented. So that's likely to have its own impact on jobs, the economy, and labour markets more generally. So even at a top level, where at the moment, where 10 years ago the crux of a lot of recruitment issues was at the level of the sector or the industry or the business, the larger market forces are having much more of an impact now than they have done historically. So first of all, I think a good starting point to just give some general context is the percent change in the UK's GDP. So on this graph, we can see the change over the last 20 years. And what we see is some slight blips around the 2008 financial crisis, not much of a change around 2016 when we had the Brexit vote. And then we get to March 2020, where we see this just biblical fluctuation in growth when pretty much the whole economy shut down for a couple of months. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on us. When we look at where we are now in terms of GDP, we're pretty much back at where we were in Q4 of 2019. But interestingly, not where the Office of Budget Responsibility would have forecast that we would be in their Q1 forecast of 2020. So we're behind where we would have been had there not been a pandemic, but we're back to where we were when this all started. On this graph, we can see the number of individuals on payroll throughout the UK by each month since 2015. Normally with population growth and immigration, there's a bit of an increase every year, and that's what we see about these lines going up. In 2020, we can then see this gradual decline throughout the months. Then in 2021, there's this really sharp uptick from about April, taking us to similar levels to November 2019. So what this really shows is that just in terms of the number of employed people in the UK, we're at, or certainly close to, pre-pandemic levels. The other interesting bit in this graph is these two spikes that we see, one in July and one in November of each year. And these are both because of the increase in seasonal workers. So agriculture in the summer, and then retail and logistics and warehousing in the November spike. But that gives you some idea of the scale across the workforce each year. Now, the data that we've got here around job vacancies is taken from Abzuna, and it shows the number of job ads each week compared to right before the pandemic in February 2020. And what it shows is there are a whopping 39% more ads live now than there were right before the pandemic kicked in. And I think that really starts to highlight that there is a huge demand for candidates at the moment. Between the 4th and 10th of October, there was a record 2.29 million active job ads in the UK, and in the same week there were around 235,000 new job postings, which is the second highest weekly figure since data collection began. And I've actually seen some data that shows that, perhaps surprisingly, Wales is currently a hiring hotspot in the UK, and it contains 4 out of the UK's top 10 most active cities for new jobs, and that's led by Swansea, which saw vacancies increase by 16%. So these are some really quite large proportions we're talking about. In terms of sectors, growth was seen across the vast majority of sectors, with 12 of the 18 sectors that the ONS uses seeing growth. Wholesale and retail trade witnessed the largest quarterly increase in job vacancies, and that rose by about a third. Other industries also saw some really large increases in vacancy numbers. So like accommodation, food services saw nearly 25,000. Professional and scientific activities was again nearly 25,000, and manufacturing and logistics saw about 20,000 as well. So I suppose the take-home point here is that there is just a huge number of vacancies about in the market at the moment. And this really starts again to highlight how competitive and candidate-driven the labour market and the recruitment landscape is at the moment. Now, when I think back to the start of the pandemic and the announcement of the furlough scheme, I was sat at home reading the news more adamantly than I ever had done before. There always seemed to be this spectre in the media suggesting that the furlough scheme would simply push back redundancies to some degree, and that when furlough came to an end, then all the redundancies would happen. I certainly think it's worth noting that as the furlough scheme officially closed from the end of September, that expectation that redundancies would start to bite about now, but so far we are yet to see the impact on the labour market. A really positive note is that the latest ONS figures show the redundancy rate remains pre-pandemic levels. So the initial signs are that we haven't simply pent up redundancies that were to be made. It looks like we have staved off the impact of that more broadly. I suppose the caveat and one consideration around this might be that seasonal work may well be mopping up some of the redundancies that would have happened. So it'll be interesting to see in January what this graph looks like and if we do get a slight uptick into the new year. And of course, one of the headlines that I think we're all aware of is just the huge growth in wages over the last year. So in July, we had a peak where wages were growing at a rate of 10% annually, and that hadn't been seen in over 20 years. It is now dropping, and we're at a current rate of around 7.2%, maybe a little bit below, which as you can see, when you compare that a lot across the last 20 years, that is still a huge rate of growth. And it looks like this is largely driven by the skills shortage. So I saw an article in the Times the other day that Waitrose are paying their lorry drivers like in between 53 and 60,000 pounds a year. And that's partly as a retention strategy because they know that if they lost the lorry drivers they have, then it would incur far greater costs. And also partly to just be hyper competitive in the recruitment market. Then in the care sector, we see things like care providers providing sign-on bonuses to try to lure nurses and care staff away from competitors. And these are all factors that help them to drive up the growth rate of wages. What I think is perhaps a little more interesting is that the steep pay rises that we're seeing are so far confined to a few occupations that tend to have long-standing skills shortages, especially those with the previous reliance on EU migrants and those where it will really take quite a lot of time to train new recruits for highly specific roles. I suppose the flip side of this is that we're seeing businesses like Prep who are advertising their roles at minimum wage. So it seems like, yes, wages have gone up, certainly in some sectors, some roles, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's an effect across the whole labour market. And we'll go into a little more detail on that later on. When we look at how wage growth is broken down geographically, there's actually quite an interesting story, I think. And what we're seeing is that it's typically the more rural locations that have experienced the highest growth in wages. So that's areas like the Highlands of Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Cumbria. They've all experienced an average of over 8% wage increase between March 2020 and July this year. And I'm sure for some of you operating in those locations, you might well already be experiencing this, but I certainly think it's interesting. Now, obviously, that data is a couple of months old now, and a lot changes in a couple of months. Unfortunately, we haven't got the most recent data broken down by geography, but having looked at the aggregate data that we have got, it certainly does look like this trend is continuing. I think this is probably partly because these areas are more likely to have people employed at minimum wage. And in 2020, national living wage was increased, so that will have been felt more keenly in those rural areas. It's also probably a bit as a result of the increase in remote working, where some people in high paid roles have moved homes to more rural areas rather than living in a city. So thus, to some extent, that might have artificially raised the average wages in those locations. And even, we can see that in the Highlands in Scotland, who've experienced the highest wage growth, I think that's probably because with international travel being significantly limited over the last year, there's been a huge rise in staycations. And Scotland as a whole, I saw numbers saying that that experienced a 40% increase in domestic tourism. And that obviously could again have an impact on wages up there and the cash that tourism brings. But it is just interesting, this general disparity where London seems to be one of the areas that hasn't experienced the highest amount of wage growth. So through all of our research projects, we have the opportunity to ask candidates topical questions. The most recent of which being, are you earning more in September 2021 than you were in September 2019? And if they received a pay rise, we were asking, did you receive that pay rise for an existing job, or was it by changing roles? And we see something quite interesting coming through. 62% of candidates have received a pay rise, And of that, 56%, so the majority, have changed jobs to receive it. So what does that mean? Well, firstly, it suggests that wage growth that we have across the economy is probably limited to, in this case, around 62% of individuals. Again, reinforcing that this isn't a huge rate of growth affecting every individual in all roles. It is fairly limited, but again, 62% is still a pretty big percentage. It also highlights the willingness of candidates to change roles when pay is involved. Lots of candidates are going to be seeing headlines about the rate of wage increase, and again, this might drive some candidates to look for other opportunities to pay more. I also think that it illustrates that wages certainly haven't stagnated as a result of COVID. A significant proportion of people have been receiving pay rises throughout the pandemic. And I think, as I mentioned right at the beginning, we're now starting to get to a point where the world for most of us has settled into some kind of normal after the core of the pandemic has hopefully passed. And I think we're in a position now to start to assess the damage and the changes that it's brought about. So firstly, the number of payroll employees is actually above pre-pandemic levels now. The latest estimate of unemployment as a percent of the workforce is just 0.5%, just 0.5% above where it was pre-pandemic. So in terms of people in jobs, it looks like it hasn't yet had the biblical impact that was perhaps predicted by some. Of course, payroll employees and the number of unemployed doesn't take into account those that might have reduced their working hours or have gone to part-time work as a result of the pandemic. And actually, a large fall in working hours was an early indicator of the pandemic's influence on the labour market, as millions of people went into furlough in April 2020. And the total number of hours worked in that period actually fell to 845 million in April to June 2020, which was the lowest level since 1994. The average weekly hours worked in June to August 2021 was 31.5 hours, and that's actually up from 31.33 hours in January to March 2020. So average weekly hours worked across the nation are now higher than pre-pandemic levels as well. As I mentioned before, we saw that redundancies don't appear to have hit in the wave that some would have predicted when furlough was brought to an end, so that's positive. So essentially, when we look at the numbers around the labour market, there are now more payroll employees, more job ads, more vacancies, higher wages, we're working more hours, and GDP is where it was at a pre-pandemic level. So it certainly seems that the labour markets have recovered past the point of that kind of like January 2020 timeframe. And actually, it's now considerably more competitive to recruit in this landscape than it was back then. Of course, I have to put the normal caveat into all of this. There should be some caution. Public sector borrowing is at its highest level since the Second World War, and inflation is predicted to rise to around 5%, which of course perhaps offsets some of the wage increases that have been experienced by some. And for those that haven't had a pay rise, it will obviously be felt even more keenly. We're also obviously not out of the woods in terms of the pandemic. There's unfortunately, of course, room for new variants, fourth waves, etc. And that could all have a negative significant effect as well. But overall, things are looking quite positive. It's competitive. It's a very competitive landscape at the moment from an employer's point of view. But in terms of the health of the labour market, it is generally quite positive. And of course, had COVID not happened, what would have been dominating the news story in the world of labour markets would have been Brexit. But that has obviously been overshadowed by the pandemic. Now, some of you might have been looking at the numbers on the previous slides and thinking that it doesn't necessarily make sense. There's a record level of vacancies and also similar to pre-pandemic numbers of people employed. And I suspect that's partly due to the impact of Brexit. So due to the huge impact that shutting down the economy for COVID has had, it's probably masked quite a lot of the impact that Brexit would have had on labour markets, or certainly made it less easy to pinpoint the exact causes of things. When we look at timelines, we left the EU on the 31st of January, and COVID really hit in March. That's what, less than 8 weeks to understand the impact of Brexit without it being diluted in any sense by COVID. And you could even argue, because COVID was happening in the rest of the world in that period, it was already starting to have a bit of an impact and a bit of a force. According to data from the Office of National Statistics, about 1.3 million EU-born workers have left the UK during the pandemic, of which around 700,000 were in London. So to give you some idea of the scale of those numbers, that's the largest decrease in population since the Second World War. So that's really not an insignificant chunk of the workforce. And it's probably one of the driving factors for the huge number of job ads we're seeing at the moment and the increase in average working hours across the UK. The hospitality sector is one of the worst hit by Brexit, and I think the COVID pandemic has done a lot to really mask this effect, especially as the government is giving a lot of funding to offset the impact of the pandemic. It's meant that it's really difficult to point the finger at Brexit for anything that's happening there, when due to COVID, the sector have been shut down for the best part of the year. But certainly it looks like hospitality, retail, warehousing, care are all going to start to feel the gap that would have been left by some of the EU workers that have moved back home. I think, as we all know, one of the other driving factors in labour markets is, of course, government policy and their strategies. And for those that didn't watch the budget the other day, one of our analysts was good enough to have it on in the background while she was working and made some notes. So, first of all, the tagline that the government has been using for this budget is high skills, high productivity, high wages. And one of the first things to take note of is that the national living wage is going up again to £9.50. So I suppose that really follows on from the high wages part of the slogan. And that's again likely to drive up wage growth. Again, especially in more rural areas, as we saw previously. So nationally, I think what we expect to see is the disparity between cities, especially London, and some more rural areas, that should start to shrink a little bit. Government are also releasing new scale-up visas for science and tech roles. And I've seen those being used in particular to target areas like Silicon Valley in the US and parts of Germany to import highly skilled individuals and make the UK kind of a leader in technology and innovation. So from a recruiting point of view, that's a tool that could be used to target foreign individuals for hard to fill tech roles. Still on visas, there's also the introduction of temporary visas for skills shortages such as lorry drivers and abattoir workers. Now, I think, as quite a few people have pointed out, why would EU workers or foreign nationals want to come to the UK for only a limited time without job security to do a job they could do elsewhere with the security of a permanent contract? So I'm a little bit sceptical of the impact that'll have, but we'll see what happens over the next couple of years. There's also talk in the budget of a skills revolution, and they've increased funding for skills and adult education by 42%, and that equates to £3.8 billion. So in the short term, this might mean that more young people stay in education, or certain perhaps lower skilled parts of the workforce go back into education, which could then equate to even more of a vacuum for lower paid workers. Obviously, in the long term, this is likely to mean we have a better skilled workforce, so hopefully there are less hard to fill roles in the higher paid kind of brackets in science and technology. But in the short term, I do expect that might exacerbate this low skilled gap a little bit. And there's also a 50% reduction for a year in business rates in retail, hospitality and leisure, which is the biggest single tax cut in 30 years. And that's obviously going to help retain jobs in the worst hit sectors. But at the same time, they're the sectors that are going to feel the loss of EU workers most keenly. So that might well again exacerbate the shortage of low skilled workers in that short to medium time frame. So a sip of water. So Halloween has now passed, and my morning coffee from Cafe Nero had a little snowy scene on it. And that tells me that we are now in the run up to Christmas. And with that, it brings the shopping season. And for all of those in retail, it's time to start hiring seasonal workers. So we've done a bit of a deep dive on the retail sector. So on this slide, we can see the average number of retail transactions over the last few years. And there's obviously this huge peak every November and then a huge drop in January. Pattern changes slightly over Christmas 2020, but it's not the seismic change that we've seen on some of the other graphs in this session. And obviously that isn't all that surprising. What is perhaps a little more interesting is the change in the percentage of retail sales that are now online. We can see a gradual increase every year, perhaps hitting a ceiling in 2018, but then again in 2020 it goes through the roof with a peak of 37% of all retail sales being online. This is a result of that stay-at-home message that was from the government, but it now raises a question of, will people go back to shopping in person? Now, the latest figures from the ONS show that across all retail channels, in September, shoppers bought fewer goods online compared to both August and last year, and they spent less to do so than in July 2021, but more than in August 2020. Now, that might well be connected to shortages, with almost a fifth of department stores experiencing shortages of services, goods or materials. And again, that might be in turn connected to the ongoing lack of HGV drivers. But at the same time, some retail stores have experienced a sharp drop in online sales. So there's potentially something interesting going on there. Now, it'll be interesting to see how it pans out over the next couple of months. So what's likely to happen if sales continue to be increasingly online? Well, there's a possibility that there will be a lower demand for in-store seasonal workers, but I think that's unlikely. From most of the businesses that I've spoken to, they're still looking at maintaining a similar level of staffing to their normal festive periods. They want to be able to grab from in-store. Just became muted for some reason. I don't know how long that was for, so hopefully you haven't missed anything. Where I think we might see the greatest impact of a transition to online retail is around warehousing and logistics. Although I think in-store retail stores obviously do rely on logistics to some degree, there's going to be a far greater strain put on distribution networks if we see another year where a high proportion of sales are online. And of course, this is one of the sectors that have been left really vulnerable to a skills shortage by many EU workers leaving. So we've got figures from Indeed that are shown in this graph, and they show searches by EU-based job seekers for work in the UK, and they were down by 36% in May this year from an average level in 2019. When we pull this data apart, we can also see it's the really low-paid jobs in hospitality, the care sector, and warehouses that have the biggest declines, all at around 40%. So that's a huge number fewer EU workers that will be looking to work over in the UK this season. So I certainly think it looks like the real challenges that many retail businesses are going to face in the next couple of months might not necessarily be around having seasonal workers in store to sell their goods, but there actually being enough seasonal workers in the broader distribution network to get the goods to them to sell from their stores, and also to be able to transit goods to their customers. And this begs this question, well, who could fill these roles? And what we're seeing across the board for low-skilled roles is an increasing squeeze on the low-skilled talent pools. So care, hospitality, and warehousing are all reliant on a pretty similar demographic of worker. And across all three, there's an increased demand for workers right now. Vacancies in care are at the highest level that we've seen for years, and it's also the biggest number out of any sector. Hospitality has a third highest number of vacancies right now, and obviously hospitality is getting a significant uplift from the government in this budget, which will probably maintain this demand for jobs. And in warehousing and logistics, we're likely to see an increase in online shopping. That will again in turn create more of a demand for warehouse workers and low-skilled logistics operatives. And then to compound all of these, lots of EU workers have left who would have previously filled these roles, creating even more of a vacuum. I suppose the slight caveat to this, and I suppose the politician spin that I might be keen to put on this would be, we know that a lot of EU workers left during the pandemic, but we don't know why they left. We don't know if they're planning on returning. So the driving factor might well have been COVID rather than Brexit. So there is a chance that we see some of these potential shortages offset by returning EU workers. But I think the running assumption is that probably isn't going to happen. And this all begs the question of, well, how do we engage with these lower skilled candidates? So recent research we carried out looked at the motivators of warehouse and care workers, and two of the key factors that came up around salary and pay, and then location. So essentially, prospective candidates in these roles are looking at an opportunity and asking themselves, can I commute to this role, and does it pay more than what I'm doing at the moment? I think it's actually quite a positive thing that these are the big factors, as they're actually factors that are under most organisations' controls. So yeah, I'm sure getting pay rises approved internally can be tough in most businesses, but it is still a factor that can be controlled rather than a broader market force. And location-wise, well, that can give a really nice tight area for internal recruitment teams or recruitment agencies to target prospective candidates. So I do know that many of the people who've signed up to this session are from retail or logistics, so I won't dwell too much on those sectors for too long. So on the next few slides, we've got data that was collected in our annual candidate survey, candidate pulse survey, and that was around 100 candidates that responded. And that was generally about their experience of getting approached about roles, and also what makes them most likely to respond to approaches. This data is from a range of sectors and role levels, so this should be taken as a general snapshot of the labour market, but please do feel free to reach out to me after the session if you'd like to share any of the data that relates to your industry specifically. I'll be more than happy to do so. The first question that we've asked is simply, how often are you getting approached about job opportunities at the moment? And we can see here that over half of candidates are getting approached more than twice a month, and that works out as 24 times a year potentially. So that's a huge amount of competition there. I also think it's worth thinking about this internally. If over half of candidates just generally are getting approached more than twice a month, that works out as at least 24 job opportunities a year, and that's probably happening to your workforce too. Often the most overlooked recruitment strategy is just simply retention. It's far easier to keep someone happy who already knows the job and has reached the point that they're really adding value to the business than it is to take someone new who needs to be trained up. It's also often far less costly financially. But again, I think this really highlights the competition that we've all got at the moment when trying to engage with candidates about opportunities, and why standing out is so important. What we can also see is that obviously candidates are getting a huge number of approaches. What I think is perhaps a little bit more interesting is who these approaches are by. We can see that nearly 90% of approaches that candidates are getting are from recruitment agencies. But when we ask the question, well, who are you most likely to respond to? Recruitment agencies are the least likely to be responded to, and direct approaches the highest. Now, to me, this really highlights why some companies are potentially struggling to fill some roles, because they're doing what they did 2 years ago, putting some ads up, being quite passive, and then also putting it out to recruitment agencies. And that's just not how candidates want to be engaged with. There is this clear preference at the moment to be engaged with directly by businesses or through their own networks, through friends or family. And I think it's really telling when we ask candidates, well, how often do you respond to approaches about jobs? And what we can see is the vast majority have responded to very few approaches. As I'm sure any recruiters that are on this session will know, you can send out hundreds of messages with very little response at times. But again, as I said before, this really highlights the need to stand out with approaches to candidates. They're not replying to all of these. And it's not just in terms of who it's coming from, but it's also around the messaging. These are all really important factors, but perhaps far more important now than they were 2 years ago. And then the final question we've asked is, what makes you likely to respond to an approach? And the number one response, with 73% of respondents saying it, was if it's an interesting opportunity. We then see pay coming up, and then some more pragmatic reasons like location coming through. But again, this highlights that pay is a contentious issue at the moment. Even if not everyone's had a pay rise, it's certainly something that's being spoken about and people are thinking about their pay. So it is something that should be looked at. And then also just that piece around messaging and around the nature of the work, and being able to sell the interesting elements and why a candidate might want to do it. So to summarise a little bit, so labour markets have surpassed pre-pandemic levels. There's more vacancies, higher wages, more competition, less workers. It's a healthy market, but it's just really competitive. And there's really no escaping this. To put it simply, when we just look at numbers, it is harder to recruit in the current landscape than it was 2 years ago. And I think anyone who's out there saying they've got a magic bullet for this, any agency that's saying they've got a magic bullet for this, is kidding themselves and lying, frankly. Brexit has probably also had an impact on recruiting low-skilled workers, and this would have been largely masked by COVID. I think we expect over the next few months to start to see the real impact of that coming through. Candidates are getting a lot of approaches about job opportunities. To put it simply, they have options. Again, it's very much a candidates market at the moment. We're also seeing the move from in-store to online retail, and that will put an increasing demand on logistics professionals and low-skilled freight workers that are already quite in demand in other industries. And finally, we're seeing that candidates are most responsive to direct approaches and interesting opportunities. So what can you do to engage candidates? What can we do to kind of remedy any of this? So candidates have options. Your employer brand and general proposition matter now more than ever. And as I said a few sentences ago, unfortunately, there is no magic bullet to counter the tough conditions of the current labour market. What you can do is make sure that all the great stuff about your business is visible. Also, just that your general proposition is competitive. I think it's also worth mentioning that having a smooth recruitment process is also more important now than ever. A good quality candidate who is active will most likely have plenty of other opportunities running in parallel. If you have a 4-stage recruitment process with a week between each interview, candidates will just go with another opportunity that moves faster. And equally, I've been hearing stories over the last couple of weeks of candidates that are dropping out after being offered because their contract wasn't issued quickly enough. And they've had other opportunities that come up and they've run with those. And I suppose, again, that loops back to, as I said, retention, as I mentioned earlier. It's far easier to keep employees or even offered candidates than it is to go out and find fresh new ones. Making direct approaches for key roles. So agencies aren't the preferred channel for candidates. Now more than ever, we're seeing that some businesses are operating the same way they were 2 years ago, 5 years ago, and are just simply sticking up some ads, seeing what comes in. And in the current conditions, at best, you're going to get a load of mediocre applications. At worst, no one's going to apply. The best candidates will be getting approached about loads of roles, often through recruitment agencies. But we know that candidates are more likely to respond to approaches directly from an employer or through their own network. So why not leverage that? It's an edge that lots of employers still aren't using at the moment. Really push those referral schemes internally and push your internal teams for making approaches. We've also worked with some quite progressive businesses recently who have their senior leaders and their hiring managers making approaches directly for key hires, because again, that's likely to leverage more of a response than just using agencies or even internal recruitment teams reaching out. We also need to talk about the interesting elements of your roles in recruitment advertising. It really does matter to candidates at the moment. An ad with key skills and responsibilities just doesn't resonate anymore. I doubt it ever did, to be honest. And this goes back to candidates having options at the moment. We know that candidates are motivated by doing interesting work, but why not have that in your recruitment advertising and collateral that you're using? If a candidate's faced with 2 ads, one with a dreary shopping list of demands of the candidate, and the other a compelling narrative about what's interesting in the work, what they could be doing in the business, and all that good stuff, then it's pretty clear which one they're going to apply for. If you're also in a position that you do have to use recruitment agencies for most of your roles for whatever reason, then make sure they're furnished with a compelling story that they can tell candidates about the work and the role, and again, not just that shopping list of skills. Give them the best chance of being able to engage with high caliber candidates if you do have to use them. Recruitment agents quite often are very good salespeople, and give them the ammo and they will be quite happy to use it. It's also worth evaluating your pay. So we know wages have been growing at the fastest rate in 20 years, and this is often kind of a hygiene factor for some candidates. If you're not competitive, then candidates just won't seriously consider you, especially in lower skilled roles. In all the projects we carry out, we typically see for roles that are paying less than about 30k a year, pay is one of the really key motivators. Because at the end of the day, people are going to work to pay the bills, certainly at that, lower levels. And if they have the opportunity to have a little bit more left over at the end of the month, most will go for it. Past the 30k mark, we do start to see like more interesting work, again, being that really key driver and that most prominent motivator. But of course, even for high caliber candidates, the package can quite often be the deciding factor to pull them to one business or another. And I suppose the really obvious bit here is that if you do pay well, then advertise it, utilize that competitive edge. We've worked with businesses before that have paid well above market rates, and they haven't been using that as a hook to get candidates engaged, when it's going to be quite a simple tool to be able to at least spark some interest with people working for direct competitors that pay less. So that brings us to a close. So do we have any questions? Let's just have a quick look. So where are we? So let me just read out the question. So, having conducted a number of informal interviews to assess skills and capabilities, potential applicants are overselling their ability. This I see as something that will only increase. What are others' experience? How can you assess this in your data research? Good question. So, first thing I would say here is I think this is largely driven, as I touched on, by wages going up generally. Candidates are seeing this, and candidates are expecting higher wages for their work, and some may, should we say, have a overinflated sense of what they're worth. I certainly think for some roles and some industries, there's almost this bit of a wage bubble, and I think recruitment being one of them, where I've seen people get jobs that are paying, I don't know, 10k more than they were on previously, but they are not a candidate that was worth that. Now, that bubble may well pop potentially once this kind of the recruitment market changes in perhaps a year, 2 years. So yeah, it is an interesting piece. How can we assess that in our data research is a very good question, and one that I'm probably going to have to mull over a little bit. Because I suppose there is this interesting piece, isn't there, around quantifying people's experience and how much they're paid, and being able to look at that. So that's food for thought for me, and I will come back to that. What questions we got? Has the labour market avoided long-term scarring? Good question. I think probably is the short answer. It's linked to human capital, and that has a huge impact on the economy based on how much money people feel comfortable spending in economic markets and how people react to the broader economic situation. I think the broader investment in skills from the government at the moment is likely to offset that to a certain extent. So there is still a large question mark at the moment around have we avoided that long-term scarring in the labour market. But I'm hopeful, shall we say, hopeful. Cool, so I think that's all the questions we've got for the moment. So if I hand back to Emma.
Hi there, thank you, Rory. I think that was really, really insightful. I think there's a lot of research that has gone into that, and I know, excuse me, I know Rory has many more in-depth analysis of this, and it was really cherry picking what was insightful for today. So if you do have any more questions, please do message myself or Rory, and we will try and answer them as well as best as we can. Following today's webinar, we will send it to you via email. If you've registered with your email address, we will send that across to you once we've got it all collated, so you can refer back to some of those slides as well. And as an ongoing, if you would like ongoing information and kind of having updated research bits. If you subscribe to our I Think Hub, which can be found on our website, Cogito Talent, this is really a hub where Ruari and his team will create case studies or insight papers and will publish them on here. But you can only access it if you've emailed, because there's obviously some great detail and analysis in there from his team. But I think it was a really good and interesting and topical webinar today, so thank you, Ruari. But yes, I think that concludes it for us. Any questions, like I said, please do get in touch, and we hope you're enjoying that. Thank you.